Welcome back. Members of the African National Congress have discussed a range of issues at the final day of the ANC's 6th Policy Conference in Nasrec. Let us now cross to SABC News reporter Natasha Piri. So Natasha, it's great to have you back. You know, we were still digesting some of those gender conversations that you were having just ahead of Women's Day. Now we understand you have Angelo Fick to have a further conversation on some of the policies that have come out there. Over to you.
Definitely, Mqolisi. Well, Angelo Fick, our political analyst, will actually take these issues further. Of course, he will be unpacking the reports back from the various commissions and from the various subcommittee chairs and rapporteurs that actually briefed members of the media yesterday. Angelo, thank you so much for joining us once again on SABC News. Perhaps let's just delve into the report back that we got from the various commissions yesterday. Starting off with international relations, we had Lindiwe Zulu just briefing, members of the media, talking about issues related to South Africa, Eswatini, Russia and Ukraine, but also the influence of the ANC on the African continent.
Absolutely. And so this is presumably just Lindiwe Zulu relaying the various discussions had in these commissions. And what one wonders is why the discussion feels so very dated. So even though it tackles contemporary issues, it tackles them from a very 20th century perspective. So it's the idea of people who have personal ties with Russia, who are involved in specific attempts, not necessarily a global understanding of where we are at this moment in history. And in this moment in history, it's that tension between the transnational and multinational frameworks, some of them, kind of supra-state, but some of them actually deeply privatized capital and their ability to negotiate things, that shapes, among other things, the relationship South Africa has with the rest of the continent it finds itself on. We are in the wake of the ACOA agreements between the United States and various African countries. For a long time, the Organization for African Unity suggested and argued for and pushed for no American or foreign bases on African soil. We're now in a situation where there are several American military bases on African soil on the continent. This is a situation where Africa's elites are articulating with global elites in ways that are often at the cost of Africans. So a Pan-African agenda in the 21st century would look very differently from how it looked in the 1960s and 70s. And so the discussion inside the ANC, one wonders whether it necessarily takes cognizance of that to articulate the positions that the party wishes to have.
What do you think was missing from those proposals?
So for me, a big hole in several of the proposals across almost all of these commissions was the reality of a climate catastrophe. And this is not something that's going to happen somewhere else. It is happening in the world we live in, on the continent we live on, in the society we live in this country, in this polity, South Africa. We have active ecosystem collapses. We have the threat of further collapses. So, for example, when people suggest that there should be offshore oil drilling, when we see large sections of land in the DRC being auctioned off, these are the lungs of the planet, right? The rainforests. Massive amounts of damage that are going to be caused. Those damages will not just have immediate environmental consequences, but as climate change increases, as the catastrophe unfolds and we see higher and higher temperature rises, we're likely to see the effect on crops. So not just crop failure, but at the technical level, the ways in which sugars mature inside plants will shift, and the ability for us to feed ourselves will shift. The migrancy problem that we face in South Africa is a global migration problem. Absolutely no comment on the global context of migration and how some African states are articulating their leaders' elite interests or their national interests with what global North countries want. And so Paul Kagame and Rwanda's solution to Britain's refugee solutions is not articulated appropriately. And yes, there are the usual remarks about Israel, about Palestine, about the Sahrawi Arab Republic and about Morocco. But that should be articulated as South Africa's partnership relations with the other members of the AU and how that works, and how the Pan-African Parliament, what is it doing in relation to this? How is it deepening democracy across the continent? In the rest of the issues, David Mahlobo, for example, spoke about the way in which there should be the silencing of guns across the continent.
And it's been long overdue.
And 2 sentences later he says, but there's also discussion about how the South African arms industry should be able to sell weapons to African countries. Well, if these are the debates that we're having at contradictory level in these commissions, how are they going to be resolved, before policy is formulated ahead of 2022's elective conference and then ahead of the 2024 elections?
You speak on issues of migration, and I mean, this is a huge issue that has been highlighted in the policy documents of the ANC, especially under peace and stability. They raised the issue of, porous borders. Just earlier on this week, we heard Aaron Motsoaledi saying that there are proposals for an immigration board, an immigration court. Of course, you know that the Border Management Act has been passed to deal with porous borders. Is this a solution and in dealing with our migration issues in the country?
Border control is going to bring you one set of temporary solutions. We also have to, and this has been a government position and an ANC position for a long time, agitate for change in those countries from which the refugees come. And often people become asylum seekers because of a lack of democracy and because of poor management of the polities from which they are fleeing. The quiet diplomacy, the infamously quiet diplomacy in relation to our immediate neighbour is an example of how if we have policy solutions directed at one issue, we need to connect it with our policy solutions on a whole variety of other issues. So if our solution isn't taking into account, among other things, the climate catastrophe, however strong we build the borders, unless we wish to become a human rights violating state, at some point we will have to become cognizant of solving problems elsewhere isn't necessarily or should be part of our solution for our own problems, and therefore engaging other states, engaging regionally, engaging continentally, and engaging fundamentally in the global space that addresses issues that aren't just about our individual needs as a country or our local needs. And here the energy solution is tied to this, as is this idea that you just simply build a massive fence with minefields. That hasn't stopped people before, it won't stop them now. And in a world in which more than, I think, 1 in 122 people alive at the moment is a displaced person, the migration crisis will get worse. And South Africa's policy frameworks for providing solutions can no longer simply be national. And this is a difficult thing for a movement that is a nationalist movement to conceive. And it's difficult for politicians who wish to, shall we say, capitalize on people's fears and who want nationalist solutions that may look in the short term like they're working, but actually won't work in the long term, to get out of that bind.
Let's also, look at issues and the report back on social transformation, especially an issue that impacts millions of South Africans, especially those who are poverty-stricken. The issue of the basic income grant, the issue of the extension of the child support grant from 18 years to 21 years old. Yes, it was tabled, but I mean, when I asked them the question of the feasibility of these grants, they had said that the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, is actually going to come back and brief members of the media about this, and he's tasked with the issues. But I mean, how is the feasibility, more or less, because Treasury basically had said at some point that, listen, they really can't afford this?
So part of the problem is that the African National Congress has long been and continues to be a broad church. The broad church used to be ideological. It is now no longer just ideological. It's a broad church of people with different opportunistic agendas. And opportunistic in its positive sense, that people are seeing schisms and wish to exploit them for gains inside their own factions that may or may not be ideological. When we think of the Universal Basic Income Grant, it is a solution that's very much inside a socialist understanding of economic transformation. But so much of the rest of South Africa's economic management is very much inside the neoliberal capitalist order. Now, many of the problems we see in the world today are the consequence of capitalism in crisis. So the environmental disaster, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, these are aspects of capitalism's crisis. We don't sit in a world at the moment where there isn't enough resources to sustain the lives equitably and decently of all human beings alive at the moment. But it's the maldistribution of those resources that is the problem. So a universal basic income grant will work in a solution that is more than just about accommodating to the existing capitalism in crisis. It requires a radical reimagination of economic systems, and that means working not just nationally but transnationally, working across borders, working with people elsewhere in the world who are struggling for similar aims. And if you only sort of suggest local solutions, what you sit with is new problems arising. So you can only have a good internal manufacturing sector if you have import and export policies that put the same kinds of taxes on goods coming from human rights violation spaces. And this is going to become the problem for South Africa in terms of the just transition to green energy. The policy documents and the discussions reflect this, that you won't be able to export your goods if they're manufactured in carbon-intensive and greenhouse gas-intensive industries. But the same is going to happen if we don't have mechanisms in place to prevent our markets from being flooded by goods that are implicated in human rights violations. It's one of the reasons our clothing and textile industry has collapsed. So holistic and integrated solutions are key to addressing the urgent needs of the 21st century. And from the discussions, one has concerns about whether or not people are working and thinking in silos rather than working and thinking together.
Definitely. Let's just also move to the issue of education. We got a feedback yesterday, and just listening to Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, she dealt with the contentious issue of the mushrooming, and overcrowding in schools, saying that there need to be programs that are put in place to deal with the crowding in schools. Were you satisfied with that?
Absolutely not, because again, it's a piecemeal approach. It says this is the problem without looking at the root causes of the problem. Root causes include poor planning. We know, because we're a country that produces through Stats SA and their valuable work, through the censuses, through the household surveys, we know what South Africa's trajectory is. We know what the population growth is. We're not surprised that there are large numbers of young people. Therefore, the party that governs this country should plan in relation to those growth patterns. Secondly, poorer countries than us with fewer resources are able to manage their education systems better. So in Mozambique, they do things like hot seating in order to avoid overcrowding, which impacts on learning. In South Africa, we can't just implement that because of the nature of the society and the femicide. So you cannot have young girls at greater risk in spaces where you don't have security in daytime, and now you'll have additional security challenges outside of daytime. So my sense is that this is a problem in basic education that is being addressed at the level of, one cannot but call it facile. Because in addition to those structural issues of not having infrastructure, of not having enough school buildings, of not having toilets or not having the textbooks, is the quality of the curriculum. We haven't produced critically literate citizens for well over 20 years now. And that's one of the signal failures of the post-apartheid education system that we must address urgently. We have a majority young population under 27 who all need interventions because they will have to come up with the solutions to the challenges created by the poor policy decisions of our last 20 years. And that means we have to make sure that they get the best kind of education. And some of that may not be comfortable for a party that has been in power and remains in power partly because of the bad education system. If you don't create critically literate citizens, Edward Said, among many others, including somebody like Toni Morrison, somebody like Samir Amin, somebody like the Mexican poet Gabriel Zaid, talks about how you then engender people who feel frustrated and can't think their way creatively out of their frustrations. And then you see the symptoms that we are seeing in this society.
Mr. Fick, you actually answered my next question, but we have to wrap it up. But I'm also quite surprised that the issue of pit latrines in schools did not come up, amongst that feedback there that was given by Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, of course, on the portfolio of education. Of course, we are still here in Nasrec. We're just waiting for the national spokesperson of the ANC, possibly to brief members of the media. He actually walked past by while I was busy just engaging with Angelo Fick. It seems as if, programs actually delayed. We're not so sure if the president will actually be closing at 1 o'clock. But of course, this is the final last day of the 6th National Policy Conference of the ANC. Of course, those outstanding subcommittee chairs still need to come and brief members of the media in regards to those commissions. And then the ANC President, Cyril Ramaphosa, will be closing this policy conference. With that said, it's back to you in studio for now.
Our eyes and ears at the 6th Policy Conference of the African National Congress. That's Natasha Puri. Thanks very much.